Do we just eat our burgers, drive our pickup truck, and say, I'm waiting for system change?
What role can individuals play in solving the climate crisis? And if you believe individuals do play a role, where do we even start?
Next, on the GrowthBusters podcast, a conversation with an environmental journalist who decided to study his every carbon emission to determine how to only use his fair share of carbon in an effort to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Calling. Call the GrowthBusters. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Welcome to the GrowthBusters podcast, where we hold your hand as you come to terms with limits to growth. We have outgrown the planet, we've hit the limits and gone far beyond. That rubber band is going to snap back, and we'd best figure out how to shrink the scale of the human enterprise before Mother Nature does it for us. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary GrowthBusters, Hooked on Growth, and co-host of this podcast.
And I'm Stephanie Gardner, GrowthBusters board member, environmental law and policy wonk, and sustainable energy enthusiast. You'll find us at growthbusters.org. Search for GrowthBusters on Facebook, Twitter, and of course your podcast app for the latest growth-busting news. We want to dive right into our discussion with our guest today, but do stick around until the end of the episode for recent relevant news items plus listener feedback. You won't want to miss it.
I'm holding in my hot little hands a book, my most recent read, Living the 1.5 Degree Lifestyle. And real quickly, I'll mention for anyone in the United States listening to this that when we say 1.5 degrees, we're talking about Celsius. It's actually 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. But that would be a lousy title for a book, wouldn't it? Living the 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit lifestyle. Anyway, it's a great book, and because of that, we've invited Lloyd Alter to have a conversation about it with us. Lloyd is a prolific writer, public speaker, former architect and developer even, based in Toronto, Canada. He's published over 14,000 articles on Treehugger, which is a really great online news resource. Used to be managing editor, now design editor of Treehugger, but real importantly, he curates and edits the daily Treehugger newsletter, which is one of the few emails that I religiously open every morning. So thank you for that, Lloyd. Lloyd also teaches sustainable design at Ryerson School of Interior Design in Toronto. And of course, most recently on our radar screen is this book, Living the 1.5 Degree Lifestyle. So thanks for joining us today, Lloyd.
A pleasure to be here.
Lloyd, we were especially intrigued to read your book and speak with you because we often do discuss the roles of individuals when it comes to combating the climate crisis and whether it can really make a difference. You know, the systems, the economy that we're all existing in. And your book is about what individuals can do. So we're really excited to dive into that viewpoint further. But first, taking a step back, can you tell us the origin of the 1.5 degree lifestyle and how you became aware of it?
Okay, the 1.5 degrees comes from the IPCC report on climate change. It's the target which we want to keep global heating under 1.5, at which point we may minimize the disaster that we're heading into if we got higher, say, to 2 degrees. And at 1.5 degrees, they've assumed that there's a carbon budget. There's a total amount of cumulative carbon dioxide and equivalents that we can put into the air. Mm-hmm. And this is a number that has to decline every year, the amount of carbon we put in, to where they estimate in 2030 it will be about reduced by 45% of what it is now. Now, if you take that carbon budget for 2030 and you divide it by the approximate population of the world, you get a budget of 2.5 tons per person average. And that's what living the 1.5 degree lifestyle is, keeping your carbon emissions, your personal emissions, below 2.5 tons per year. Now, that's based on a concept of lifestyle emissions, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated. There was a study that was done in Finland by Aalto University and some other organizations that picked up research that said that basically 72% of our emissions are lifestyle choices. What we eat, how we live, what we buy, how we get around, the decisions that we make. Now, obviously, lifestyle isn't entirely your choice. If you live in the country and you have to drive a pickup truck for work and it's a long way in that, did you make that choice? Did life make that choice? But it is something that could conceivably be changed. And so that's why it's called a lifestyle emission. So in fact, what the real budget was 3.4 tons in 2030, but you took the 72% of that they ascribed to lifestyle, and that's how you got 2.5. So what I set out to do, after learning about this Finnish study from an English activist, was to see if I could actually rearrange my life to emit less than 2.5 tons of carbon in the year that I was trying to do this. Does that explain it?
Very well, very thorough. But I think it's going to be important for some of our listeners to get a point of reference. So I'm thinking that the average annual carbon footprint of someone in the U.S., isn't it something like 6.5 tons, Stephanie?
I thought it was 15.
17,
17. Okay, see, I was way off.
We're both underestimating.
That's the total, and then you have to back it out to the lifestyle, and it's about 14 tons of lifestyle that we're talking about, 14 or 15. If you're in the 1%, if you're in the really rich people, and I don't mean like super, super rich, I just mean average rich, you're probably up there at 30 tons because you do some flying, you go to Florida for the winter or something like that. And if you're in the ultra rich, you could be in the 60 or 70 tons.
Well, and you're a Canadian, and you guys are right up there with us in the U.S., aren't you?
Yes. Yeah, they're very, very close.
So that's a drastic reduction in lifestyle emissions. So obviously you got to be sitting naked in a teepee now.
Well, no, actually, you don't, because there are options that you can take, things that you can do that are different. Now, I happen to also be extremely lucky as someone who lives, say, in Buffalo might be, or someone in Washington State, that our electricity is really clean. It all comes from hydroelectricity and from nuclear, and there's no coal burning. So I've got a leg up already. We're talking carbon. We're not talking energy. For 50 years, since Jimmy Carter, we've had an energy obsession, but we have to recalibrate and think about carbon, and it's a very different thing. So by living in a house that's lit with green electricity, I can leave my lights on all the time, and it doesn't affect my carbon footprint. But I have a gas furnace, that does. So, that's how you have to look at things differently a bit. If you drive an electric car, you don't have any operating carbon emissions, or you do some if you're getting your electricity from coal. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of choices.
So you've set out to alter your lifestyle, to live the 1.5 degree lifestyle. Was this kind of an experiment to see if it's possible, see what it would be like?
Yes, when I read the original Finnish study and looked at it, I thought this is something that could be done. And when I met this English activist, she was going for the 2050 target of 1 ton of carbon. And I looked at that and said, that's absolutely impossible. That's like background noise. That's just breathing. In Canada, I'm going to be doing at least 1 ton. In fact, when I started seeing where my carbon footprint was, it was bizarre. So what things were big and what things were little. So I decided the 2030 target of 2.5 tons would be doable. And, you have to break your life up. In the original study, they broke it up into mobility, how you get around, nutrition, what you eat, housing, how you live were the 3 big ones. And then there was also consumer goods, what you buy. And so those were the things I independently had to look at. Now, I had a really lucky break. We had a pandemic, so nobody was going anywhere or doing anything. So it automatically cut everybody's carbon footprint down dramatically. I actually knew people living in New York, living everywhere without even trying. They're living a 1.5 degree lifestyle because there was nowhere to drive. They weren't going to work. And, we all as a society, we dropped carbon emissions 7%, which is what we have to do every year between now and 2030. Look what happened there.
Right. And it's not repeating what we did every year, but it's finding another 7% to cut every year, right?
Yes.
And where did the impetus for writing the book about this experiment come into play? Did you decide at the beginning or partway through that you needed to write this book and get this across to others?
It's on a subject that you talk about in the movie and that I see in all of your biographies and all of your lists of references on your site. I've been really concerned and thinking about this issue of sufficiency for a long time. That if we're going to solve our energy and our carbon process and problem, what is enough? How much do we need? What is sufficient? And I thought that, this might be a really good opportunity. What with I'm spending a lot of time at home with the pandemic, and I've always wanted to write a book, and I pitched it to the publisher, and the publisher said, sure, we love it. And so I went from there. I needed the book for the real emotional push to make me try and do it, and to convince my wife to come along and not cook me any red meat for the rest of the year and things like that.
Very cool. In fact, you brought up your wife in the dedication, I think, of the book. You dedicate it to your wife and two daughters.
Yes.
And there's an indication that for your wife, Kelly, that she had to put up with this.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, she likes red meat, and she had to deal without that, and weren't going out very much because of the pandemic at all. I basically stopped driving. I was never very fond of driving, and I got myself a good e-bike for the start of this. And, driving is just about the biggest thing in most people's carbon footprint, even if it's an electric car, because of what's called the embodied carbon of making the car. A car is a real problem. And so you want to sort of lightweight your transportation as much as possible. So, that put a little more responsibility on her at times, but she was very amenable and supportive. And the key thing, for instance, if I'd said to her, okay, we're doing this whole thing and we have to be vegan for the next year, I think she would have drawn the line at that, because going vegan is a tough lifestyle change. But when you look at the carbon footprint of various foods, you find that going vegan is the best thing you could do, but going, for instance, vegetarian doesn't make much difference in it at all. Because dairy, when cheese, is almost as bad as red meat. It's from a cow. Now, we weren't going to give up cheese because my daughter is a cheesemonger, but we definitely cut back, and we definitely cut out red meat. And, for instance, when you look at this table from the British Our World and Data people, tomatoes have a higher carbon footprint than chicken. And you say, how can this be? How can a vegan's going to eat a tomato? But what happens is that tomatoes have a very limited season where they're grown in the field. And the rest of the time they're grown in hothouses, which are gas-fired. Or they're in Europe where the table was made, they're all coming in from Spain. And so, anything that's grown in a hothouse is basically gas-fired food. And you have to not eat that, which is why we tended to eat a seasonal diet of what you could get now and that wasn't flown in or trucked in from California. So it was a more limited diet than people would have when you're not having all of the fresh fruit coming in by truck. Refrigerated transport is actually hugely underrated as a thing, because these things leak. These air conditioners on the trucks leak a great deal and put out fluorocarbons, which are a terrible, terrible greenhouse gas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned very interestingly that in one of your earlier careers, you were a developer, and I think you kind of maybe did a back of the cocktail napkin calculation of what your carbon footprint was back then when you were living high on the hog, making money hand over fist.
Right. Well, I wish I had made money hand over fist instead of losing my development company, but that's another story. But at the time, I lived like a developer. I drove my little sports car. If I was going 3 blocks across town, I joined a ski club 3 hours north of Toronto, where I would, drive up, get electrically winched up a hill to go down electrically made artificial snow, and then drive home. And I traveled a lot. I loved to travel and, added it all up, and I was doing at least a 30-ton footprint.
Whoa.
At least.
So you gave that up, your income dropped dramatically, and so did your carbon footprint. And I just wanted to kind of make a note of that. The lesson there seems to be, wow, you can work a lot less and kind of take it easy, and that helps you be a better citizen here.
Yeah. Well, my carbon footprint really didn't drop that much when I went into prefab housing and I had to drive my Subaru all over Ontario, drive a 5-hour drive to meet a client. But, you started to realize these things. And then when I started writing for Treehugger and getting serious about the environmental footprint of things, I realized that's when I came into the question that everybody talks about efficiency. And what happens? We just got bigger cars.
Yeah.
When housing got more efficient, we got bigger houses, further apart. That efficiency is not a good standard to judge anything by. And because we just get more of it. And that's sometimes called the rebound effect or Julians Paradox, which is very controversial. But I happen to really believe it exists. So for me, that's where I learned about sufficiency. And you link in one of your references to the Simplicity Institute and Samuel Alexander, who runs it, who had this line that I absolutely love. Without sufficiency, efficiency is lost. That if you don't actually decide to limit what you're going to actually do, then, the efficiency won't matter. I mean, the biggest change I made was going from a gasoline-powered car to an electric-powered bicycle that weighs 40 pounds instead of the 3,000 pounds of my Miata or the 5,000 pounds of every other car that people are driving now. So sufficiency is the key. Moderation in what you buy and how you get around, even in what you eat. I'm bouncing around here, but let's go back to food. It's not just sort of what we eat in terms of the meat, for instance, being the main thing, and the dairy, but the quantities. If you look at the quantities and the size of the plates, the serving sizes in restaurants and in most houses now compared to, say, 1960, where donuts were this big and they're this big, and a hamburger a Big Mac became something even bigger, and all of these chains have competitions of the Whopper and the this and the that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And, so much of that is superfluous to what we need. If you ate what was sufficient, we would have far less waste in food, and we'd be healthier, and we'd be saving money.
Very good point. And I'm looking forward to getting into more details about all of these kind of subcategories under lifestyle changes that you can make. But first, kind of really high on my list is this notion that, writing this book implies that there's something important that we can do in individual choices that maybe don't necessarily depend on the government or big corporations to do the right thing. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. You mentioned in your book a statement that Elizabeth Warren made in 2019 in a presidential candidate debate. Let's listen to some of that statement.
There are a lot of ways that we try to change our energy consumption and our pollution. And God bless all of those ways. Some of it is with light bulbs, some of it is on straws, some of it, is on cheeseburgers, right? There are a lot of different pieces to this, and I get that people are trying to find the part that they can work on and what can they do, and I'm in favor of that, and I'm going to help, and I'm going to support. But understand, this is exactly what the fossil fuel industry hopes we're all talking about. That's what they want us to talk about. This is your problem. They want to be able to stir up a lot of controversy around your light bulbs, around your straws, and around your cheeseburgers. When 70% of the pollution, of the carbon that we're throwing into the air comes from 3 industries, and we can set our targets and say by 2028, 2030, and 2035, no more. Think about that right there. Now, the other 30%, we still got to work on. Oh, no, we don't stop at 70%. But the point is, that's where we need to focus.
Lloyd, there's a lot of conversation out there on the internet about this, and you kind of corrected the record a little bit, so I want to give you a chance just to react to what we just listened to.
Well, there was what she's referring to mainly as a study that was done in 2017, the Carbon Majors study, that was a study of the major producers of fossil fuels. And it listed them. There's different kinds of emissions. There's Scope 1 emissions, which are the emissions from actually making something, and they're the Scope 3 emissions when you're actually using something. And the Guardian read that study and they put up a big headline, which is 100 companies are responsible for 77% of all global emissions. Mm-hmm. And this became a tagline. It's still flying around the internet like mad. What I do doesn't matter. It's the oil companies. And I have a collection of tweets because some of them are hilarious. 77% of the emissions come from oil companies, so my making Bitcoin is irrelevant. My air conditioning is irrelevant. My flying is irrelevant because it's them. But the point is that 90% of the emissions in that study were what are called Scope 3. Mm-hmm. It's us buying what they're selling and putting it in our gas tanks and firing up our furnaces. It's us buying what they're selling is the fundamental thing. And we saw what happened when we stopped buying what they were selling during the pandemic. Like fracking companies went bankrupt. Oil companies lost billions. The system doesn't work if we don't buy what they're selling. So what do? You go to the oil companies and say, we want you to stop selling oil? Well, no, because then everybody's going to be screaming, how do I fill my truck? They're screaming right now. Oil's so expensive, do something. So these are all, when it comes down to it, consumption issues. The other thing about those 100 companies is when you look at the list, they're like 3 in the top 10 that are actually companies you'd recognize as companies. There's Shell and there's ExxonMobil, and I think Chevron comes in at 11, and the rest are China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia. They are national entities. They're not companies. Uh-huh. And they're not going to say, we're going to clean up our act. I mean, look what they're doing right now. So the situation is that where I believe Elizabeth Warren was wrong is that all of these things in the end come down to consumption choices. Now, there's no question when you turn it around that the fossil fuel companies, and really I think the auto companies, have worked with the politicians and the planners to almost entrap us. That you can't say, well, how is this my choice not to drive if there's no transit, if there's no bike lane? They've forced people to consume. Mm-hmm. There's no question that a lot of it is beyond personal control, but that's where you start making the changes. You start saying, okay, city, we're not going to say, we're not going to have gas stations because people still need to buy gas, but give us bike lanes, give us alternatives, give us transit. Change the consumption pattern, not the production pattern.
Yeah, we have a lot more power than some would have us believe. It's kind of, seems like a false choice. We shouldn't be picking one, right? We should be putting as much force as we can behind our government to change policies and behind those corporations to change what they do. But a lot of that starts with us.
Well, and a lot of that, it's so hard. I mean, we are so locked into the automobile society. It enabled us to buy suburban houses so that we basically have to drive to get a quart of milk. And that's how society got laid out after World War II. And it was a conscious decision at the time that this is where we wanted society to go. And that's what we have to change now.
Yeah, one of the quotes that you included in your book really resonated with me. It looks like it was from a Slate article written by Lior Hackle and Greg Sparkman. And they wrote, ask yourself, do you believe politicians and businesses will act as urgently as they need to if we keep living our lives as though climate change were not happening? Individual acts of conservation, alongside intense political engagement, are what signal an emergency to those around us, which will set larger changes in motion. And I think this really stuck with me and really encapsulates what we've been talking about the last few minutes here. Is like, does anyone trust that the leadership of our countries, of businesses, are going to make these changes that are so desperately needed in this emergency situation? I don't have that faith. I don't think my peers that I talk about this with have that faith. So it's on our shoulders. It is something that we need to do. And I think, I love all of the content you have in here about the bicycling. I mean, bicycles are accessible and affordable, and something that is just so easy to make that switch. It's a little scary. I'm personally a little scared to ride on some of the roads around my house.
Yeah.
But I feel so inspired to make that change and know how much of a difference that can just make.
And they were really hard. Bikes are a hard sell in a lot of climates where it gets really hot or cold, and in a lot of places that are really hilly. But we're in the middle of an e-bike revolution that changes everything that way. That if you're in the suburbs, you're willing to go a little further because you've got a motor. You can actually go shopping and carry stuff. You can go up hills, and you don't need to dress like you do on a bike. You can dress like a normal person because the bike is doing a lot of the work, and you won't overheat in the summer and you won't freeze in the winter. So it's, I think we're really on the cusp of a revolution, but it won't happen unless people feel safe riding. And so that's why there have to be those political changes where we, in Toronto where I live, the suburban politicians who control the whole city, they just refused to let bike lanes go in. Every bike lane was a war. And then the pandemic came and they put in all these emergency bike lanes. And you know what? They kept almost all of them. They said, this works. Stores actually found their revenue went up because people could bike there and didn't have to search for parking spaces. And, we've got an instant bike infrastructure that we wouldn't have had without the pandemic. So you can get change.
Yeah. And, until some of that change happens, it is harder, not necessarily impossible. And in fact, you've proven, you're managing to live the 1.5 degree lifestyle. So you've proven that you didn't have to sit on your butt and wait for all of these systemic changes to happen.
Well, I was also extraordinarily lucky in another way that I just happened to live in what, you have in Boston and in a lot of American cities, a streetcar suburb. That when the streetcar was invented, they pushed out into the suburbs outside of the core, and the houses were built at a certain density so that everybody could walk to the streetcar to get downtown to the office. So you didn't get sprawled because you'd be too far away from the streetcar. So I live on a 30-foot lot in a 3-story house, and all my neighbors are like that. And these are all like incredibly expensive houses now because that's how everybody wants to live. And I can walk up to the main street and I can do, all the local shopping. But I was also lucky enough to live just north of a rail line, and that was all zoned industrial. So that's where the big stores went. So I can go to the big grocery store down here, the little shop over there, and it made it much, much easier. If I'd lived in a suburb in a bigger house with a bigger gas bill where I had to drive to the shop, it would not have been so simple to live this lifestyle.
Well, I'm still not going to let everybody off the hook, but it's good to acknowledge that you're a little bit lucky in that respect. And that was a great piece, that Slate magazine piece. We'll include a link to that in the show notes. And circling back to that, this notion about politicians and what they're going to do, the people that are making the policies that will help us move the systemic change along. Just imagine if Mitt Romney gets up in the morning and he's headed down to the Capitol to make policy, if everybody he runs into and everything he sees along the way, it's business as usual, what's he going to do versus what if he walks out the door and everybody is acting like it's an emergency? You don't think that's going to chip away at the decades of growth-worshipping programming that Mitt Romney fell victim to?
Well, and more and more people are going to be banging on his door saying we have to do something, because if you look at the crisis that's happening right now in Europe and what the response is, which is to stop buying Russian gas, and America buys a lot of Russian gas as well for certain parts of the country that don't have pipelines going. There are two ways that you can deal with this crisis of rapidly increasing oil prices and limited supplies. You can, as some are saying, let's just get back to fracking the whole country like mad and make more fossil fuels. Or there are other people. Well, I saw a tweet from a Republican politician who was showing the picture of him filling his truck and, the 140 gallons of gas there, whatever he needed to fill his giant pickup truck. And he's saying, thanks, Joe Biden, for this, when what? Why did you buy such a massive pickup truck? Why are you complaining about the price of gas when you're driving this monster truck? So, This happened in the 70s. Everybody started buying Pintos and Vegas and little cars.
True.
And this is where the Japanese car movement took over, because people respond to income things like this, to price points. And suddenly, I would not at all be surprised if everybody's starting to look for more fuel-efficient cars again, and maybe I can't drive my F-150 because it's starting to cost me a lot of money. So what Mitt Romney has to decide is, do we get out of this problem by fracking the country to death and drilling and drilling and drilling and opening up the Arctic and doing more wells here? Or do we just consume less? You know, Jimmy Carter wasn't wrong.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about this. You write in the book about social norms, and I think there's so much power, besides you reducing your footprint and doing your part, the power of you doing it, and maybe a friend or a neighbor doing that, and a family member doing that. This peer influence is so big. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And you have a great story, brief story in your book about the signs in hotel rooms about towels.
Right. I always hated those signs because they're not doing this for the environment. They're doing this to save a few bucks washing towels.
What did the signs say?
I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly.
Basically asking you to reuse your towel. Throw the towel on the floor if you need new towels.
Right.
But you'll be doing the planet a favor if you hang your towel up, and then we won't replace it every day. But then they did change the signs and put down how many hotel guests.
Yes, that was the point.
I can't remember what they said, but 72% of our guests reused their towels. And that changed the number of hotel guests that were hanging up their towels.
My favorite analogy of all of this is smoking. You know, most of the population used to smoke. I used to smoke. And first we found that it was bad for us, and government started making it harder to buy them. And then what I think the huge change was when they determined that secondhand smoke was bad. So suddenly I'm not just hurting myself. When someone next to me is smoking, they're hurting me. And suddenly it became socially unacceptable to smoke. And it became that there were fewer and fewer places that you could do it. And the proportion of the population that actually smoked has dropped to, what is it, a quarter of what it used to be, I think now. And it became antisocial. And in a lot of ways, you know, when you see 72% of people are hanging up their towels, it became sort of antisocial to be extravagant and demand an extra towel.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen a lot of it in a lot of the mask wars and a lot of the stuff that's been going on with the reaction to COVID, is that it's become a social and a class thing almost, about how do you react to these things. And that's why I'm thinking eventually it might be seen as antisocial to be driving a pickup truck in the city as a family car. That people will just look at you, you know, I'm short, and some of these trucks come up to my nose. I mean, their front of the hood. It's like really, really awful. And they obviously consume huge amount of resources to build them and to fuel them. That F-150 that I'm so obsessed with, the new electric F-150, has a carbon footprint in its manufacture because of the amount of steel and amount of batteries and everything into it. It's got an embodied carbon, or upfront carbon, as I prefer to take. Before you even drive it off the lot, 40 tons of CO2 has gone into the air, a 40-ton footprint. And if you go to 2030 and multiply that 2.5 tons out, or in fact to 2050, that's our lifetime allotment of carbon before that truck even goes off the lot.
Wow.
So how can we say that this is a good thing to have electric pickup trucks like this? We should be teaching people about sufficiency. How much do you need to get around? If you really have to drive, look at this little car. And how much you can get in it, really, when you put down the back seat. And really, if it's less than 6 miles away, have you considered an e-bike? You know, again, we have to get people in tune with what is the most appropriate and properly sized thing to do anything that we do. Here I am going back about sufficiency again.
Yeah, and I think you're also sort of describing what you mention a lot in the book, this concept of a modal shift. You know, going from a gasoline-fired car to an electric-fired car is not the kind of change that we need at this late stage in the climate crisis. You need to switch to a bicycle.
Yeah, or a streetcar or a bus.
Public transit, yeah.
Yes. And, we have to make real modal change in the modal change is the really important thing. That's just the itsy-bitsy change, especially when you get this understanding of upfront carbon, the carbon that goes into making everything, which we've always ignored. Because remember, the crisis before was an energy crisis. So what mattered is how much fuel are we using to power something, not how much steel went into making it, or concrete.
Yeah, and that apparently was a big aha moment for you. You were doing this grand spreadsheet to guide you in your decision-making. And it sounds like you were astonished to discover how important the embodied carbon, or what you like to call upfront carbon emissions, are.
Yeah, my best example is my obsession with every new Apple product. I was sitting there and stacking up my MacBook Pro and my watch and my AirPods and my iPad, and Apple, more than any other company, totally reveals the carbon footprint of their entire product line. And so my little iPhone 11 Pro that doesn't weigh much at all, when you look into Apple, they tell me it has a carbon footprint of 80 kilograms of carbon. So that's amazing. I mean, you and I couldn't lift 80 kilograms if we tried, but that's what the phone weighs in carbon that went into the air. When I totaled up all of my Apple products in a stack, and then, as Apple said, amortize it over their projected lifetime of the product, I found that buying my Apple stuff, not running it because they take nothing to run, but buying my Apple stuff and measuring their embodied carbon was the second biggest thing in my carbon footprint after the gas in our furnace.
Wow.
And I was shocked. Now, there's a very easy way to actually solve this, and that is, don't buy them so often. My last MacBook was a MacBook Pro I bought in 2012, and I kept it going until I bought the latest one, and it's still going. I gave it to someone who's still using it. I mean, these things last. And so that's the key. You keep your car for twice as long, and you cut its annualized embodied carbon in half. So this is the other thing that we have to get out of in the consumption thing, is this urge to always buy new stuff. That if you buy something of high quality and you keep it a really long time, every year you keep it, you're dropping your annual prorated carbon emissions of that out.
Yeah, unplugging the wall wart that charges your iPhone is really nothing if you're replacing that iPhone every 2 years.
Yeah. I mean, they've designed because they want you to use it a long time and go all day, so they're incredibly efficient in their electricity use. And the new MacBooks with the new Apple-designed chips, they just sip electricity, but making them. So much metal goes into them, so much rare earths and other materials and lithium.
Lloyd, I'm glad that you've been talking about sufficiency versus efficiency and Julians Paradox. I think maybe we should explain briefly that paradox for any listeners who maybe haven't heard about that. Would you care to do that?
Yeah, I'll give you my favorite example because, when you go back to Stanley Jevons, what he was doing at the time, his paradox originally was that coal mines and tin mines all filled up with water, and they figured out how to do a pump, a Newcomen engine, a steam engine, but it was very inefficient, and it was using tons of coal and barely pumping out the water. And so everybody was saying, we've got to make a more efficient steam engine, which will use less coal, because otherwise we're going to have huge problems. So James Watt came up with an engine that used 1/30th the amount of coal for the same energy. And so everybody said, now we're all going to use so much less coal. But what happened was that this engine was so efficient that people realized, hey, we don't need to just pump water with it. We could put it on wheels and have a train. We can put it in this factory here and we can make stuff with it. We can run all the looms and everything on it. And we can have an industrial revolution. And suddenly the world was using 100 times as much coal as it did before. So Julians Paradox is that when you make something more efficient, you use more of it. And it's hugely argued as people saying, that, well, it's incremental, just because fridges are more efficient doesn't mean you buy a bigger fridge, is a main argument. Well, that's because fridges fit in a 36-inch space that you left for it. If you go down and look, you'll see a lot of rich people are buying 6-foot wide fridges now when they design their kitchens.
Or 2 of them.
Yes. But my favorite example of Julians Paradox gone mad is the light-emitting diode, the LED bulb. That if you look at any statistic about LEDs, and if you look at your house, you switch all to LEDs, and you're using a fraction of the electricity that you used to, because you get, for 6 watts, what you used to get, you get the light of what you used to get as 60 watts. So everybody just flat out says, look how much money they save, aren't they great? But then you start looking around, and what do you see? You start seeing LED billboards running all day long because they can run billboards cheaply. You see buildings encrusted with LEDs. If you see a picture of Shanghai in particular, in China, they're crazy about this, that all the buildings are lit up. They're moving screens on the buildings. Everything's lit up like mad. If you go into my media room in the back there, which is really just a closet, but like it's got a TV in it. TVs get bigger and bigger every year. More LEDs come in. LEDs were a technological revolution equivalent to that steam engine, that suddenly we're not just using them to light our homes. You can get carpet where they're embedded in carpet, wallpaper where they're embedded wallpaper. Buildings are covered in them. I have a picture of this house that's open now in Florida for the National Builders Show, where they show a picture of the dining room ceiling, and it has 60 LED fixtures right across the ceiling, light bulbs just there, because you could do these things that you could never do before. And when you look at pictures from space, they've found that the level of illumination from parking lots and from roadways and from all over is massively more than it was just 10 years ago. Because these lights are so efficient, people are buying more of them. So it's Julians Paradox gone wild. They're using LEDs in thousands of ways that we never used light bulbs before because they were too expensive. Yep. And it's not just a matter of a slightly bigger fridge or a slightly bigger car because of the increase in efficiency. This is just, I think all of those savings from inventing the bulb are like going into the sky because we're the way we're using these things now.
Does all of this sort of boil down to the way our economy is set up, this perpetual growth economy where the goal is to just sell and buy more and more every year?
More.
Absolutely. If you can run all these LEDs, why not have 50 of them on your ceiling? It'll look great. And I've walked into houses now that you could do surgery. I mean, they got so many lights in the ceiling. The amount of light that's getting on the table when they're all turned up is ridiculous. And then there's all this new smart technology, for instance, that they put in. I did a calculation of over my dining room table. I have these 3 Philips Hue adjustable color light bulbs in an old 1950s fixture. And those are connected wirelessly back to a controller. Now, let's say we sit at the dining room table for an hour a day. They're drawing, in that hour, the 6 watts per bulb that they take to run. But the other 23 hours of the day, there's a little trickle of electricity where that light bulb is talking to that controller, which is talking to my phone. And when I did the math and totaled it up, that those bulbs are actually, that fixture is drawing more electricity waiting for me to turn it on, listening for me, than it actually is running.
Wow.
So it's still together using less than it would have running an hour on incandescent bulbs. But, we keep designing ways to use more power in that.
So LEDs would be great news for living the 1.5 degree lifestyle. They would be great news for reducing our carbon footprint if we embrace that technology and weren't kind of at the same time celebrating what we've been celebrating for 100 years, which is more of everything, more sales, more revenue, and higher GDP.
Right. What do we do about this? This is the issue of degrowth. Degrowth is, I think, one of the biggest issues of our time. And, it's something you can't talk about in North America too much. If you're green, you have to say green growth, green growth. We're going to keep doing it and it's going to be green. If you go to Paris and you go to Europe, they're beginning to talk seriously about degrowth. Like, how do we unwind? How do we design a good life for ourselves, make a good living where the economy isn't constantly growing and growing and growing? And that's I think, the issue, that nobody over here is willing to face the problem, that green growth may not, I had a real problem with this in my book, because I thought, well, I can decouple my energy from what it's doing. By riding a bike, I'm decoupling transportation from energy consumption. That there's all kinds of decoupling that you can do. But can we actually run a society without constant economic growth? That's a real problem. If everybody took an attitude of sufficiency, that I don't need my new MacBook because my 2012 one's working perfectly, poor Apple wouldn't be a $3 billion company if more people thought like that. And Ford wouldn't be building F-150s out with batteries.
Yeah.
So this is the problem. I know you made a whole movie about it.
That's a huge cultural shift, but we don't seem to be making much progress on that one thing.
I do think it's a worthwhile experiment. I think it's new territory, right? It's a new frontier, a way of being, a way of existing, especially within, the North American culture of consume, consume, consume. But at this point, I think it's something we have to try. It's the next experiment.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the reasons I love this concept of a carbon budget is that if you have that fixed amount, you have to figure out how to fit everything you want to do into that. But, you had your spreadsheet, Lloyd, but how do we, as people that don't have spreadsheets, how do we figure all that out and kind of make those trade-offs in all of our choices?
Well, I think the main way you do it is by just not being doctrinaire about life, like not saying, I'm never eating another hamburger again, but saying, I'm not going to go to McDonald's twice a week. I'm going to go twice a month. I'm going to try and practice more moderation in what I do and just dial it back. A lot of young people who live in apartments and don't drive cars, and a lot of them are actually vegetarians or vegans, they might well be living a 1.5 degree lifestyle right now without even thinking about it, just because they're not being big consumers of all this stuff. There's an English program that was just started that came out after the study right now that you should have a look at and maybe do a link to, is called The Jump. And what they did in The Jump is that they took another study that I actually mentioned in my book, the C40 Cities study, which said, well, if we're going to do this, that everybody's got to commit to just buying 3 new articles of clothing a year, or you're going to keep your computer 7 years instead of 3. And it just made a list of things that you could do. And if people just did these things this way and made these decisions, you're only going to take 1 short trip this year and you can have 1 long trip every 3 years. So we're not saying, oh, you can't fly anymore, you can't do this, you can't do that. But they just said, budget it. Here's a budget. You can do this much of this, this much of this, this much of this. So many burgers, so many steaks, so many suits. And when you looked at it this way, it just worked out well.
And then once people embark on that new lifestyle, it sort of becomes their new normal, their new habit, right?
It does. You get used to it. You don't want to have steak every night, even then you decide you're not doing this anymore, because that's not healthy and it's expensive.
Yeah, you've saved money and you feel better biking,
Yeah. It's a sufficient lifestyle is a frugal lifestyle. And, you save a lot of money. And, there's this great cartoon, I hate my job, but I have to drive here every day to pay for my car. I mean, if you figure out that you don't have to do these things that you don't want to do, then maybe you don't need so much money in the first place with a sufficient lifestyle. And you're not as dependent on growth.
Yeah. I was really glad to see that you shared my affinity for Samuel Alexander and the work of the Simplicity Institute.
Yes.
So we'll include a link or two in the show notes to some of that, because that's really valuable stuff too. Lloyd, we haven't talked about a lot of the things you learned about and had good observations about some of the choices that we can make. Will you come back for another episode where we can get into the details about truly living the 1.5 degree lifestyle?
I'd be happy to.
That's great. So my last comment is, you had to do all this work. You had to come up with this spreadsheet. You have to jump through so many hoops and do all these somersaults to figure out a way to live honorably, nobly, and do the right thing. Isn't it a shame that we have to work that hard? Why do we have to work that hard to live well? And I think we have to do that as long as we have policymakers who are looking at GDP growth every year and insisting that we keep on growing the global economy and the national economy and the state economy and the provincial economy and the city economy. And also, we're going to have to keep working that hard if these policymakers also have any success, and hopefully they won't, at convincing women to start having more children again so that they can have more taxpayers and more consumers to keep this Ponzi scheme going.
Well, it is a Ponzi scheme, exactly as you say. What did George Bush say? We've got to keep making the pie higher. And it's a real problem. Most people, I believe, if they would look in the mirror and think about, how do I really want to live? Do I really need that house with the 3-car garage in the suburbs? Do I really need the pickup truck? If people looked in the mirror and said, well, I earn this much money, what could I do to really make it go a long way? They'd find it isn't that hard to reduce your carbon footprint. And when you reduce your carbon footprint, you're reducing your spending. And when you walk more instead of driving, you end up being a lot healthier for it. So there are all these good things that come out of it. And it may not keep the GDP growing as fast as they'd all like, but it'll keep your personal happiness growing.
Yeah, let's start watching that happiness index.
Yes.
At the end of your experiment, were there any positives that your wife noticed and was sort of surprised about or happy about that was an outcome for her?
I cannot think of one right now, but I've noticed it in my children. I mean, they're both committed into healthier lifestyles and bicycling more. And my daughter has a long ride. She has a 6-mile ride to open a coffee shop at 7 every morning that she does in the dark on her e-bike. And, they recognize the value of this, and I'm extremely proud of that it is something that people look at and say, A, this makes sense, B, I save money, C, I'm healthier for it.
Well, it's apparently contagious because your daughters caught it from you, and they have some friends that'll catch it from them.
They are.
Well, thanks. So we'll have another episode where we'll get into some good lifestyle advice with Lloyd Alter. Lloyd, can't thank you enough for the important work that you're doing and for spending some time with us on this episode today.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd.
Wow, that was a great conversation, and I'm glad Lloyd's going to come back and join us again.
Yeah, that was obviously a great introduction, and excited to have him back for some more details. So should we do our Honey, I Shrunk My Footprint segment?
Yeah, let's do it. I really wanted to invite him to participate because he could do that with half his brain tied behind his back, but I forgot to keep him on for that.
I think he would have put us to shame.
Probably
with
so.
Everything he's been doing. So, Dad, what have you done recently to shrink your footprint?
I have a really interesting one, and I'm going to confess it's not something I did, but it's something I figured out I am going to do next time. Basically, this is like a lesson I learned yesterday. I drove my mother. She doesn't drive anymore, and so she needed me to drive her to go visit a friend. And she was going to stay with her friend for an hour and a half, and it was on the other side of town. So I did not want to drop her off and then drive home and then drive back to pick her up because I never stopped thinking about my carbon footprint. So I thought I need to do some grocery shopping so I can find a grocery store in that neighborhood and get my groceries while I'm waiting on her. Well, darn if it wasn't like a food desert out there, and the nearest grocery store was 5 miles away.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm driving to that grocery store, and it's just bugging the hell out of me that I'm driving 5 miles and 10 minutes one way, and another 5 miles and another 10 minutes back to do my grocery shopping. And I thought, you know what? If I waited until I dropped my mom off back at her home, there's a grocery store on my way back to my house from dropping my mother, I would have no extra miles.
Yeah.
So the only issue would be that I'd have to be more creative about what I'm going to do with this hour and a half while I'm waiting for my mother. And I had reading material with me. I could have sat in the car or sat in the park or gone for a walk. I was trying to save time. If it had been rightly more important to me to save the carbon emissions, then I would have said, I'm going to spend a little more time grocery shopping after I take my mom home, but I'm going to drive a lot less. And so that thought process is what I went through, and so I'm kind of glad that I figured that out. And that's my honey, I'm going to shrink my footprint next time.
Well, we'll hold you to it. We'll check in with you next time and see if you carried through with it. So mine is yesterday, I applied some insulation to our attic hatch. We had built an attic hatch last year at some point that was just sort of a piece of plywood, and then there was no insulation sitting on top of it. So that's obviously kind of like a hole in your roof that all your heat's going out. So we had some leftover foam insulation from another project. I cut it to size, glued it on there, and put it back. And now I think I have R16 value insulation on that attic hatch. So I don't know if that we would see a huge difference in our energy bills, but hopefully it's making a dent.
You may or you may not, but there's joy in that. And that's one of the things that Lloyd writes about is houses and how it's becoming a lot more acceptable, desirable, and even demanded that houses be tighter and better insulated than they used to be.
Yeah, I found that section really interesting.
Yeah, we'll talk with him about that in the next episode. Okay, so listener feedback.
Yeah, let's go through what folks have written in or called in about.
I want to share this email I got from Todd. As always, I absolutely love the gift of listening to your podcasts. Thank you so much. One thing that I haven't heard mentioned are the psychological impacts of the limits to growth. Humans have been here for around 300,000 years, and during all that time, there has been growth. If you think about growth, it's expanding, open, trusting, altruistic, benevolent, and safe. If you think about degrowth, it's contracting, closed, suspicious, selfish, and fearful. So in this context, I see our bumping up against the limits to growth reflected in our personal, local, and national politics. More and more people are attracted to authoritarians who will help them feel safe and fix the problems, which usually involves blaming them, minorities, people of different races, sexual orientation, religion, etc. I also see this fear reflected in the rejection of science and attraction to conspiracy theories. People are afraid and looking for answers, and it's frustrating that no one in charge will have an honest conversation about limits and overshoot. So, as if overpopulation, resource depletion, climate change, and economic insolvency weren't enough, we also need to consider the global psychosis which is taking over our population. Anyway, it's just one more thing to consider. Thank you again for all you do. Boy, that was a mouthful. Thank you very much, Todd, for those thoughts. Stephanie, I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I agree 100% with everything he wrote. Maybe it's because I'm so far beyond this growth-worshipping paradigm that our culture still seems to be sitting in, but I just don't see growth as open, trusting, and altruistic and safe.
I think attitudes are definitely changing day by day as we come to terms with the impact that growth has had on not just our climate, but also our day-to-day lives and stress and anxiety, and being a cog in the capitalist system doesn't feel very altruistic to me these days. But yeah. I think the concept here of just what is the psychology behind how people feel about it, I think could be a really interesting topic to dive into.
Yeah, and I think he's describing pretty accurately what most people probably do sort of subconsciously feel about growth, because growth has been just on a pedestal for a couple hundred years. But we haven't been growing for 300,000 years. I mean, so much of human history, human population, and even the human economy were fairly stable. They had some ups and downs, but, we really didn't experience much growth in population or economy until just the last 500 years.
Yep. So the next set of listener feedback we'll share, we're all in response to our most recent episode, which was episode 65, What Do College Students Think Their Future Will Hold? And we'll link that in the show notes. Judith in Colorado sent in an email. She said, "Excellent and so encouraging to know there are students thus engaged and thinking. Kudos to Prof and the students. How common do you think you'd find a comparable class in other institutions?"
What do you think, Stephanie? It's probably a better question for you to answer.
I think most universities have classes like this now, but I would say that the number of students flowing through them compared to the entire student body is really small.
Right.
So those classes are there, but I don't know that people participate in them at the levels that they should.
So if you convened a group of students that weren't studying environmental policy or environmental science or ecological economics, then completely different conversation.
probably.
Okay, we're pretty proud of our hotline where listeners can provide feedback orally to us, and we did get a voicemail from Lee Badger, so let's listen to that.
Hey, Dave and Stephanie. This is Lee. I thought that was a great episode with the interview with the class. Especially liked your discussion after the class discussion was over. That helped me a lot. I'd mentioned a couple of things. Was that in the class it seemed to be that no one stepped up to advocate individual action, to be the change you wish for the world, as Gandhi would say. Maybe I missed it, but was that there? And number two, an old mentor of mine back about 1990, when we were talking about natural resource depletion and environmental problems, says, well, we haven't made much progress, but it takes a generation. And it seems to me maybe it takes a little more than a generation, since we've been there for 30 years since he made that comment, and we haven't seen the change we ought to see.
Thanks, Lee, for that.
Yep, I think some good points that he made that resonated with him, too. Well, we really love hearing from you, and you can send your feedback to us via email at podcast@growthbusters.org, or you can leave us a voice message at our listener feedback line. That number is 719-402-1400. And as usual, we'll select some of the feedback to share during our next episode.
Okay, well, let's turn our attention now to some recent growth-busting or not news. We have to start with some late-breaking news. We're recording this episode on February 28th, and just this morning we got news of the second part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their latest assessment report. The first installment of the report was published last August, and it was pretty bad news. It was focused on the physical science of climate change. Anyway, this part 2 that was published this morning, I believe, The Guardian summarized it as climate breakdown is accelerating rapidly. Many of the impacts will be more severe than predicted, and there is only a narrow chance left of avoiding its worst ravages. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said, "I have seen many scientific reports in my time, but nothing like this. Today's IPCC report is an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership." There are going to be 2 more additional parts of this series of studies published this year leading up to the next COP happening in Egypt in the fall, but this is the bleakest report yet.
Yeah, it's definitely bad news. I know every climate report that comes out is kind of increasingly saying the same thing of like, oh, it's more severe than we thought, and like we're off track. But, I think the comment in the Guardian article, we'll link to that in the show notes, is that this might be the last report, because I think they do them every 7 years. This might be the last report that they put out while we still have some time to do something about it. It might be way too late by the time they put out another report.
Wow. Yeah. So if we were ever going to, stop in our tracks and consider this the emergency that it really is, and every nation make it a national project to undertake extreme measures to get their carbon footprint down, to live within the necessarily shrinking carbon budget, now would be the time to do it. And that ought to be the result of this, but I don't really see any signs to hope that it will be, sadly.
Yeah, and I'll be keen to hear or read additional coverage of this report. This did just come out, so we were trying to find a quick article that would help us understand at a high level what's going on. But I'll probably even dive into some of the IPCC materials online.
And I want to give a quick shout out to The Guardian, because it's really one of the few really major news organizations out there that gives the environment a fairly decent amount of coverage. They also publish George Monbiot's column, which isn't always as enlightened as it ought to be, so shame on them for that. Put some pressure on George to get with it on the overpopulation subject. And so the next time I log in, I'm going to respond to the pop-up that comes up that tells me I've read something like 232 Guardian news stories in the past 6 months or something like that. Wouldn't you please contribute to support the work we're doing? I am going to do that, finally. Shame on me for waiting that long.
As an example of not the best climate reporting, I think the next one we have to share, this is from ABC News. It was published January 22nd, and it's called How Young People Can Make an Effective Change in the Climate Crisis, According to Experts. And the main ways that they describe for making this change is to essentially make their voice heard and put their voices together. That's the summary. But I pulled out a couple of key parts here. But beware of the false dichotomy between collective action and individual action, Morgan Edwards, an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a leader of the university's Climate Action Lab, told ABC News, adding that reducing personal emissions or shaming others' lifestyles is not fulfilling or effective. There's no price of admission to the climate movement, she said. Trying to think about just how you can reduce your personal emissions can feel really lonely, whereas being part of something bigger, finding a community to take action together with, I think that's a much more empowering way to think about climate change and centers the conversation around those who are responsible for the crisis, which isn't you as an individual. So I thought that this rhetoric was really interesting and really, especially in the context of the conversation that we just had with Lloyd. So, Dad, what was your reaction to this?
Oh, me, oh my. Where to begin? Those statements by Morgan Edwards were really disappointing. She said, reducing personal emissions is not effective. Well, that feeds right into the negative impacts that social norms and peer influence can have when people don't have the courage or the inspiration or the leadership traits to do the right thing and lead the change that we need to see in the world. You remember that famous quote attributed to Mahatma Gandhi, "Be the change you want to see in the world"? You know, if 1 billion people decide, yeah, what I do doesn't matter, we can do nothing but sit on our butt and eat burgers and drive our pickups.
Maybe tweet about your opinions.
Yeah, there's incredible power, and the actions of millions or billions of people do add up. It's just basic math. Now, being part of something bigger definitely has value. We need to have a national project, and there's real power in peer influence and changing social norms. So that part of being a part of something bigger, Morgan Edwards was right, but that doesn't mean that you have to choose, and that doesn't mean especially that you should ignore the conversation around what you can do as an individual.
Or that you aren't responsible. I mean, she's basically saying you're not responsible, but we just had a great conversation about all of the lifestyle emissions that you are responsible for, that you do have choice. And to just ignore that choice completely, I actually feel like that's not empowering.
Yeah, there you go. This happened about a month ago, but I just hadn't had a chance to get to it here on the podcast. Back on January 27th of 2022, U.S. President Biden highlighted the GDP numbers after his first year in office in a White House statement, and the language just caught my attention, so I'm quoting here. The GDP numbers for my first year show that we are finally building an American economy for the 21st century, with the fastest economic growth in nearly 4 decades, along with the greatest year of job growth in American history. And for the first time in 20 years, our economy grew faster than China's. Well, what do you think about that, Stephanie?
Well, sounds like the rhetoric that the White House would want to put out.
You know, kind of political survival, isn't it?
Yep.
Sadly. Well, I have a comment, and that is that a 21st century economy is not one that seeks or celebrates fast growth. It's an economy that meets needs while contracting back to a sustainable level. That is a 21st century economy. Sorry, Joe. Give me a call and I'll economy-splain that to you. Come on. Global Footprint Network data tells us that globally we're making nearly twice the demands that the Earth can sustainably meet. In the overdeveloped world, we're engaged in 3 to 5 planet living, depending on which country you are in. Growth is just an outdated goal, and it's going to end this century either by design or by disaster. Borrowing a phrase there from Peter Victor, author of Managing Without Growth. Do we want to let growth end by disaster, or do we want to design our way back to a sustainable economy in the 21st century? It's going to happen one way or the other. And lastly, Steph, competing with China for fastest growth, that's like drag racing toward the rim of the Grand Canyon. Not a race you want to be in.
It's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, the White House, I'm sure, is going to put out a statement about the latest IPCC report. And they're going to talk about how, like, oh, my gosh, we need to double down on our climate commitments and get this legislation passed. And then they're going to be talking about GDP growth in the next sentence. And these two things are oxymoronic. You can't have both. We just can't keep going the way we're going. We need to make some big changes to the way we think about our economy.
Yep.
If we have any chance.
Next up, in Burkina Faso, which is a country in West Africa, the Catholic Church is renewing a campaign to stop the use of contraceptives as a form of family planning, according to a Catholic News Service article. Now, that article states that the Church's campaign has attracted support from the majority of Catholics in the country, who opine that it's God who has the power to give children, and the use of contraceptives risks women's health. Now, of note here, in 2020, the fertility rate in Burkina Faso was 5 children per woman, with only 22% of women of reproductive age using family planning. Now, back in 2020, the population of the country was almost 21 million people, and projections indicate that it's going to surpass 50 million people by 2058 and be at 82 million by the end of the century. And 40% of the population lives below the poverty line.
Yeah, so all of this isn't adding up to me.
No. This is sad news about what the Catholic Church is trying to do in that country. They're trying to keep those people poor and destroy any possibility of the children and grandchildren in that country ever being able to live decent lives.
Yep, they're not connecting the dots between women's reproductive rights and lifting people out of poverty. And having a child is really dangerous to women's health. So I don't know how the use of contraceptives is risking women's lives.
Yeah, that's crazy. Shame on the Catholic Church there. And sadly, it's happening in other places too. There's critical opposition in Nigeria to its new revised national policy on population for sustainable development. President Buhari in Nigeria is championing this expanded access to modern contraceptive methods, but apparently that's being met with some opposition. Don't know how significant that is, but that's a shame because Nigeria is one of the most populated countries in the world, projected to overtake the U.S. in the number 3 position soon, and that does not bode well for the people of Nigeria or the people of the planet.
Well, let's end on some good news. What little of it there is. France has introduced free birth control for all women under the age of 25. Previously, contraception was made available for free for minors, but now 18 to 25-year-olds can also access it. It could benefit up to 3 million women, and it's part of a series of measures that President Macron's government is introducing to boost women's rights and alleviate youth poverty. And this was kind of reported at the end of the year, and I think it went into effect on January 1st. So good news there.
Bravo. If I had a glass of French Bordeaux in my hand, I would raise a toast to France for doing the right thing. And that's important, especially since this really highlights the contrast with some overdeveloped countries like the U.S. and Poland, where access to contraception is under attack, and really countless other countries that are foolishly wringing their hands today about what is really good news, declining birth rates.
I thought we were going to end on some good news, Dan.
Well, that kind of reminds me of another quote. Marketing wizard Guy Kawasaki. He was on the marketing team behind the launch of the Apple Macintosh computer back in 1984. Very successful entrepreneur. And he wrote, "The good news about entrepreneurship is that your fate is in your hands. The bad news is that your fate is in your hands." Now, I'm thinking we just dropped the words about entrepreneurship from that quote. The good news is that your fate is in your hands. The bad news is that your fate is in your hands. It's really up to you, whether to make it good news or bad news. The good news is the fate is in your hands.
I feel really lost now. Hopefully that made sense to someone out there.
Well, as always, we'll include links to these articles that we've mentioned in the show notes. And you can learn more about all the issues we discuss in this podcast at growthbusters.org.
The growthbusters.org homepage is also where you can donate or get on our email list.
Now, if you think this podcast is important, we certainly do, share it with people that you love or just people who need to learn more about limits to growth. Subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app so you don't miss an episode. Doesn't cost you a thing.
There's also the GrowthBusters documentary, GrowthBusters Hooked on Growth. It's free on YouTube and worth a watch. We'll link to it in the show notes.
And finally, thanks a lot to Jake Fader for writing and producing the GrowthBusters theme that you hear at the open and close of this podcast, and to Carlos Jones for singing it.
Talk to you next time, Dad.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters. Whoa.